So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah! The NFL Combine is officially underway. Yesterday on February 29th, the defensive linemen and linebackers did their athletic testing. Today is going to be defensive backs and wide receivers, and tomorrow is going to be quarterbacks and running backs. So 3-day of the NFL Combine is officially underway, and the Detroit Lions have wasted no time getting in interviews and working on their draft board. The Detroit Lions, as of today, have conducted 12 different interviews, heavily focusing on the defensive side of the ball. And today, I just wanted to take a look at all of those interviews, take a look at all of the players the Lions have showed interest in so far this draft cycle, talk about potentially their fit, as well as the pick that could potentially be spent on them if the Lions decide to go that direction. Now, combine visits don't necessarily mean that they are going to pick up a player. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to draft a guy or that they're going to pick a guy up or whatever the case may be, but it does indicate that there is some level of interest there by the Detroit Lions, and it gives us a good look at positionally what they're looking for, potentially play style-wise what they're looking for, and really what the Lions are looking to do going through this draft season, right? Last year, we talked a lot about the combine visits, and a lot of those guys turned out to either be Detroit Lions or guys that were very highly valued by Brad Holmes and this Lions staff. So with all of that being said, let's take a look at the 12 visits the Lions have already conducted. Take a look at the 12 players that potentially are on the Detroit Lions radar. Now, despite being very defense heavy, we're actually going to start off on the offensive side of the ball with the 3 wide receivers the Lions have already taken a look at. That being Xavier Leggett, the wide receiver from South Carolina, Brian Thomas Jr., the wide receiver from LSU, as well as Devontae Walker, the wide receiver from North Carolina. Now, if you're not sensing a theme here, Brad Holmes has a type at wide receiver. We saw it with Tyrell Williams in year 1. We saw it with DJ Chark in year 2. The Lions like themselves some big wide receivers that can run. They don't right now have that prototypical X wide receiver and really haven't had that guy consistently for any of the time that Brad Holmes has been the general manager, despite several actions in order to try to find that guy, right? As we talked about, Tyrell Williams in year 1 was a 6'4" wide receiver that ran in the 4.4s, played about 4 snaps before his career was ended in Detroit. The year after that, DJ Chark was brought in on a 1-year, $10 million deal and was a very good X, right? A 6'3" wide receiver that runs in the 4.3s. Prototypical X, was pretty good with the Lions, but had some injury concerns and walked because of a smaller contract offered by the Lions. And last year, the Lions really didn't have anybody like that. They had Amon-Ra St. Brown, obviously. They had Josh Reynolds, who's a bigger guy, but isn't necessarily the speedster. They have Jameson Williams, who's 6'1" and a speedster, but he was not very healthy. And it seems like the Lions are still very much looking for that archetype and that playmaker to add to their offense. And they found a couple of guys that they may be interested in. Xavier Leggett stands at 6'1", 217 pounds. And last year at North Carolina, he put up 1,255 yards and 9 touchdowns. Brian Thomas is the wide receiver 2 at LSU, stands at 6'5", 198 pounds, had 1,177 yards last year and 17 touchdowns through the air, despite being the second most targeted wide receiver by the Tigers. And Devontae Walker, after transferring from K-State a year ago, was now at North Carolina and as the 6'3", 175-pound receiver and his favorite target of Drake May. He put up 700 yards and 7 touchdowns with North Carolina a season ago. The Lions clearly like their big body wide receivers. They like the guys that can go get the football. They like the guy that can stretch the field down the field quite accurately. And they're looking potentially for a wide receiver 1 in this draft. Now, Brian Thomas would likely have to be drafted with the 29th overall pick if he makes it that far. Xavier Leggett likely would have to be a trade up into the second round or a trade down into the top of the second round, while Devontae Walker is probably more of a late day 2, early day 3 guy, but a player that would still likely warrant somewhere between a top 100 and a top 120 pick. All 3 of these players, I think, could very well fit in with the Detroit Lions, and with Josh Reynolds and Donovan Peoples-Jones both being being on free agency this year, there's a good chance that the Lions target wide receiver through the draft and try to get that big body player to finally fill in as the solid X wide receiver. Now, the Lions, as I said, have focused quite a bit on the defensive side of the ball, and they've interviewed linebackers, defensive ends, as well as secondary members. But they've only interviewed one linebacker so far, that being Aaron Casey, the 6'2", 228-pound linebacker from the University of Indiana. The Big Ten linebacker was phenomenal last year. 109 tackles on the Hoosier defense, 20 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, and 3 passes defended. He's a really good all-around linebacker. I think is a well-rounded skill set that could fit with the Detroit Lions really well. He's been a good leader on the Indiana defense for quite some time. He's a good size. He's got good strength. He's got good enough speed. He's kind of a jack-of-all-trades linebacker. He can cover decently. He can rush the passer decently. I think he's got really, really good instincts when going towards the line of scrimmage. And I think if the Lions do want to potentially replace a guy on the defensive side of the ball, right, if their linebacker core is getting expensive and they feel like maybe they can replace a Derek Barnes, or they can replace even a guy like on special teams like Anthony Pittman, right? There's not a whole lot of room right now in that linebacking core, but I think, adding some more depth at linebacker could never hurt. Obviously, you have Jack Campbell, you have Alex Anzalone, you have Malcolm Rodriguez, you have obviously Jalen Reeves-Maybin, you have Derek Barnes. All of those players, with the exception of Anzalone, being on their rookie contract makes linebacker not the biggest need for them right now, but obviously, Aaron Casey is an incredibly talented and young linebacker, and if they want to take him, if he does fall to a certain range, I could totally see the Lions drafting him and potentially starting over and moving on from a guy like either Malcolm Rodriguez or potentially Derek Barnes, despite I think the fact that the Lions like all of them. I think there's a good chance that the Lions potentially, just with contracts and how all of that works out, could potentially be looking for more depth and more talent at that position. In worst case scenario, he turns into a very strong special teamers with some developmental portions for his career. Now, the big part of this interview process has been with the edge rushing class so far. As the Detroit Lions have interviewed 4 edge rushers on the first day of the NFL Combine, that being Darius Robinson, Braylon Trice, Marshawn Nealon, as well as Nelson Caesar. Now, Darius Robinson is the one that a lot of people know about. Darius Robinson is the very young defensive end from the University of Missouri, who last year put up 8.5 sacks and 14 tackles for loss. He grew up as a Detroit Lions fan. He's 6'5", tested very, very strong athletically, and he is a player that very well and very likely is on the Detroit Lions radar for the 29th overall pick. Braylon Trice is a player that is projected to go more towards the top of the second, more so than the end of the first. But last year with Washington had 7 sacks, 11.5 tackles for loss, and I believe actually led college football among pressure leaders. I believe he had the most pressures in college football a year ago, and we know that the Lions like their players that can get a lot of pressure. Braylon Trice, again, is a guy that could potentially be in play at 29 or could potentially be in play as a trade-up scenario in the early or middle stages of the second round, as the Lions do not pick until about that 61 spot at the very tail end of the second. Now, Marshawn Nealon was a standout at Western Michigan, only had 4.5 sacks and 7 tackles for loss, but led the Western Michigan Broncos in both of those categories. He is a player I think that has pretty good bend. He's a player that's not projected to go until very late in the draft, very late on day 3. Could be a late season pickup, could be a late draft process pickup, and I think might not turn into a great player, might not turn into an all-time starter, but I think could add some valuable depth for a local kid. Then Nelson Caesar from Houston had 9.5 sacks and 13.5 tackles for loss a season ago. Just a very productive player, the most productive player that they've interviewed so far among the edge rushers. Again, a guy that's projected to go kind of middle of day 2 to early day 3, and a player that I think could come in and help the Lions out quite a bit on the defensive line. The fact that they've interviewed 4 edge rushers, that is twice as many as any other position that they've interviewed so far at the Combine, tells me that they're looking pretty heavily into that position, and that not only could they draft one relatively high, I think they could go as far as to drafting 2, as well as addressing the need in free agency. We know that Romeo Okwara is likely leaving. We know that Charles Harris is likely out. We know that Julian Okwara is likely, or actually is for a fact, not going to be here, as he was signed by the Eagles a couple of weeks ago. The Lions are down. The Lions do not have a lot of depth right now at that edge rusher position, and I think that they could address it significantly in the draft with 1, if not 2 prospects, as well as a free agent or 2 to go along with it. And then we're going to take a look at the defensive backs, as the Detroit Lions have said pretty clearly that they're looking for some defensive back help in the draft as well, interviewing both Kool-Aid McKinstry and Quinyon Mitchell at the cornerback position, with Stone Vaki and Malik Mustafa at the safety positions. Now, Kool-Aid McKinstry is the household name, potentially being a faller in this year's draft cycle, with guys like Teron Arnold being a little bit bigger name, with Quinyon Mitchell having a great Senior Bowl, with Cooper DeJean having just the freaky athletic testing, with, Nate Wiggins in the mix. There's a lot of good cornerbacks in this draft, and Kool-Aid seems to be falling down the draft boards. Now, I think this is due to the fact that Kool-Aid really wasn't targeted a whole lot this year at Alabama, really didn't put up any significant stats, didn't have any incredible highlights, which I think speaks volumes to him as a cornerback. The fact that you would want to target Teron Arnold more than you'd want to target Kool-Aid McKinstry, I think that speaks volumes to his game. Kool-Aid has 2 career interceptions and 23 passes defended. He's a phenomenal lockdown cornerback, potentially falling in the draft just because he's so quiet as a prospect, but could potentially lead to the Lions getting him in the mid-20s, if not falling all the way to the 29th overall pick. Quinyon Mitchell, on the other hand, the cornerback from Toledo, has been actually a riser in this year's draft class after having a phenomenal Senior Bowl, after having a great career at Toledo where he totaled 6 interceptions and 45 passes defended. Quinyon Mitchell is projected to go somewhere between the 15th and 22nd overall pick, somewhere in that range. And he's a guy that I think will be drafted potentially over Kool-Aid because he's made a lot more noise in the draft process and because he has been a little bit more of a flashy player in the media as opposed to Kool-Aid McKinstry. Now, Stone Vaki is a safety from the University of Utah who has 1 career interception, 5 passes defended, only played 2 years with the Utes, is not somebody that I think would be a huge necessity for the Lions, but somebody that they clearly have seen something in. And then Malik Mustafa has been a safety for Wake Forest for the last 3 years, has 3 interceptions, 7 passes defended, and has been a pretty strong part of that Demon Deacon secondary over the last couple of seasons. And as of right now, that is all we have. Those are the 12 prospects we know that the Detroit Lions have interviewed at the Combine. Wide receiver, I think, could be a sneaky need for the Lions this season. Obviously, linebacker is something they really like out of Aaron Casey. They haven't interviewed very many, but clearly they like something in the Indiana Hoosiers game. Edge rusher seems to be a massive need, as well as secondary. It seems like the Lions are addressing it. It seems like the Lions know very well that they need to have some upgrades on the defensive line, and they need to have some upgrades in the secondary. And I would not be surprised if Brad Holmes got really aggressive this offseason and was able to go get potentially 2 of those guys, Darius Robinson, Braylon Trice, Kool-Aid, or Quinyon Mitchell. I wouldn't be surprised if the Lions walked away with one of those players, if not potentially 2 of those players, if the right deals can be made. But with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Day 2 of the Combine is underway as we speak, so we'll probably have some more updates after that, and we'll probably have some more visits to talk about. Let me know down in the comments below what player you want the Lions to interview, what player you want the Lions to have a visit with. Very curious what you guys have to say, and very curious what your favorite prospects are for this year's draft class. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so very much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions.